Hello, everybody. Excited to be joining in this virtual learning environment for the Talent Week being organized, especially for the small and medium enterprises. My name is Prashant Bhatnagar, and I'm excited to be moderating this discussion with two distinguished individuals who had decades of experience with them in varied areas. Let me introduce you to both of them, and then we'll get started. Joining me today is Sankar. Sankar Ramamurthy. He's the Chief People Officer at PI Industries. Extensive experience, having advised many companies, having led people function in many of these organizations. Sankar, welcome to the video chat. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashant. And thank you all. Lovely to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sankar. Joining Sankar is Ajay Raghvan, who is a lawyer by profession and leads the employment practice at a specialized firm called Trilegal. Ajay, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Prashant. Hi.
Thank you. Wonderful for you joining us. So the format is fairly simple. We're going to use the power of the technology and the power of the internet to be able to communicate to a large variety of audience across, who hopefully will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. The topic for us today is around tailoring for the right size. What factors, internal or external, lead to an organization thinking about right sizing? And perhaps, and you may be thinking about this, the first impressions when somebody thinks of right sizing is perhaps about downsizing. So we'll spend some time talking about that right sizing means, perhaps what does that mean? What are the legal implications of that? How does one think about that? What are the people implications of that, given most of us are in people business? And how do, therefore, small and medium enterprises deal with issues like this, which are perhaps part and parcel of the environment that we are operating in? I will pose questions to the panelists. They will be able to respond to it, share some of their experiences, and hopefully you will be able to connect to some of their experiences during this. If there are any specific things that you'd like to be able to ask and inquire from them, please use the hashtag SME Talent to pose questions at the end of this, and we'll do our best to be able to respond to you. All right, let's get started. My first question is to you, Sankar, given your extensive experience, having worked in the business, having worked with many of these firms. In your opinion, what factors, both internal or external, lead an organization to think about right sizing, and kind of what perhaps an organizations can do to prevent them in the first place? Any experiences from you that you could begin to get started?
Thanks. It's such a topical question given the economic uncertainty that we face today and the increasingly volatile and uncertain environment in which businesses have to operate around the world. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that this is the new normal. Mm-hmm. When we all had very stable, long careers and redundancies, right sizing, these were seen rare exceptions, but they are not. They are pretty much, and the reason for that is the acute uncertainty in the economic environment, such that the best laid plans of men go awry. Right sizing, which is used, as you said, downsizing more than in the sense of upsizing. Two reasons. One, business conditions have changed on managements to contain costs and to meet shareholders, and they look to reducing costs all around, including people costs. That's one reason why this happens. Business models change. Technology, old business models obsolete. So the old way of doing things disappears, and with that, the people associated with the old business model and so on. The second reason is mergers and acquisitions. Deals, when one company normally happen for two reasons. There are synergies to be gained on the cost front, and number two, advantages to be gained on the revenue front. Give for the company, because doing so gives us access to new markets. Mm-hmm. Cases, right sizing does not happen usually, but when because of cost synergies or pressures on companies to grow and shore up margins, then you can bet your bottom dollar that there is going to be areas where redundancies will be identified. And for example, if two banks merge, I was involved in a banking transaction, Centurion Bank and Bank of Punjab some years ago. right? It means that the Indian branch and the Bank of Punjab branch next to each other on the same street, then obviously one of them is redundant. You'll have to decide which and what to do with the staff. That gives occasion to right size, downsize, restructure the organization, and so on. So these are some of the circumstances, or I would say the main drivers of circumstances leading to right sizing.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. I particularly like the way you framed it. This is the new normal, and right sizing is perhaps kind of something that we have to now become used to, as opposed to think of the ordinary or extraordinary in the past. Sankar, just kind of pulling you into this conversation as a specialist HR professionals. Obviously, there are people issues associated with that, not just the business aspects of it. Can you maybe think of any examples of how some of the people issues have been dealt with, not just the business rationale? We get the business rationale, either synergies of costs or revenue optimization, which may result in this, or the example of the branch that you gave. Two branches have to make a decision on one branch. But there are real people involved whose livelihoods are perhaps now being kind of put at risk. How does one deal with such situations?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question, and that's where HR professionals play such. There are two things involved here. One is the legal obligations, and Ajay would be in a better position to answer that question, which companies must be acutely aware of. The second issue, when companies downsize, they do so, or right size down, but to grow in a very different way, which means they are still going, and they have to be acutely conscious of the fact that they have their brand reputation at stake. And one key pillar of a company's reputation is how it deals with their people. Of an instance where a multinational bank, which was forced by reasons globally, after the financial crisis in 2008, to downsize significantly in India, I was involved in the program managing the downsizing and the HR aspects of the downsizing. They did it in a very exemplary way. What did they do? First, process of identifying which staff they have to let go of, right? That's number one. And they put a lot of thought into doing that. They recognized that this was a very traumatic event. It's not easy. And therefore, they underpinned this whole program by a series of empathetic and yet firm communications. Not just a written mail from the president or whoever it was, but a series of town halls where and explain the rationale behind what they were doing. Three, they employees owned opportunities within India. And what they did was this effort through an outplacement program. They had a consultant come and sit in the bank premises and had a help desk. Employees could call in to speak to the outplacement agent, or looking at what opportunities might there be for them and how are they best with those opportunities. For example, the outplacement consultant would give them training resumes, training in facing interviews, and so on. Now, identified a psychologist to be part of the team to be stressed by it. And the usual emotions, the first emotion is anger. Why me? It's not my fault. It's management's fault or the government's fault or something else. Why me? Sorrow and anxiety and so on. Unfortunately, in India, we have a history of this kind of thing. So being let go of from a job seen as stigmatic. Society, he was thrown out of a job, so he's not a good guy. You know what I mean? And recognize that that's not necessarily the case. People are let go for various reasons, the competence, capability, or performance. But still, employees are very anxious, so psychological help, right? And lastly, they also underpin this whole program with a very generous redundancy package, much more than was before, right? So all of these things helped the efforts to go very smoothly. And when employees left, they still carried away very, very good memories of this organization.
Understand. Thank you.
Companies can do to make sure that they soften the blow and they do an empathetic way that doesn't harm their brand reputation, and that really was seen as being very helpful to the employees who had long years before this.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think you outlined a process which is very useful. So just deciding who to perhaps begin with, who needs to be right size, I think is the first critical step. And perhaps often the one which is not where enough attention is given to. I think it's a critical one. And recognizing this is a traumatic process, so not just one-way communication, but also series of town halls, also helping people understand the rationale, the act of providing outplacement services in different forms and formats, whether it is as simple as resume writing or interview training, and the psychological support needed with that. I think those are very good points. I'll come back to have a follow-up on this, but I come back to this. Just getting into the legal aspects of it, Ajay. In this example, or perhaps other examples that you've had of experiences, as a firm, I will have to make some of these hard choices from time to time. These are perhaps, as Sankar puts it, the new normal. How do I deal with the legal issues associated with it? For example, in an earlier conversation, you were talking about the distinction between a layoff versus a termination versus retrenchment. Walk us through that aspect of it, and then
Sure. Thanks, Prashant. And I think Shankar made some very valid points in what he said. And I'll sort of explain why I think HR has a very significant role to play even in a legal process. I think the single sort of most important sort of issue to deal with is legal processes, unfortunately, in India, as far as termination is concerned. Any sort of termination, any sort of disciplinary action, any sort of negative employee sort of position is fairly complicated, because the law actually in India has historically been pro-employee, and therefore the way our law has been sort of set up and geared, it's been geared in a manner to protect employees. And therefore, in the environment that we currently live in I think the way businesses have changed today, most companies want to have that flexibility of being able to sort of bring in and take out people based on clearly commercial reasons. And the law, unfortunately, hasn't really been sort of conducive to that sort of environment. Our laws were created about 60 years ago during independence, a large part of it, where the social structure and the sort of industrial structure in India was very different. It was largely factories. We were trying to sort of protect employees from being exploited. And therefore, most of the laws that were created to put certain sort of steps in place to ensure that employers dealt with employees in a sort of I guess in a reasonable way. Coming to the specific sort of points that you raised, I think there is some distinction around the law in terms of how you look at a layoff versus how you look at a termination. Most people use this fairly interchangeably in regular parlance. So when people talk about layoff, typically you are referring largely to an exit or to a termination. The law, at least under what is called the Industrial Disputes Act, makes a distinction between these two. Layoffs are typically sort of temporary, sort of when a company is unable to function, and this is again goes back to the history of the law itself. There were times where coal wasn't available, electricity wasn't available in factories, and therefore factories couldn't function for certain periods of time, and that gave them the flexibility to lay off people, or essentially say, don't come into work on this particular day. I'll give you a part of your compensation. You don't receive all of it. But the idea was this is a temporary phase and then they come back. That's where layoffs was sort of historically used in the legislation. Redundancies and terminations, actually the word retrenchment is the word that's used in most legislations in India, again coming back to the Industrial Disputes Act, and that's really what sort of refers to exits. I'll just quickly talk about the distinction and where, from an employer's perspective, if you had to look at these things, where would you start? We've got two key pieces of legislation in India. There is the Factories Act that applies to pretty much anyone who's in the manufacturing space. And there is the sort of Shops and Establishments Act, which is a legislation that covers anyone in the commercial establishment space. So typically your service industry is covered by that. Terminations are actually sort of covered in different legislations, including the key piece of legislation being the Industrial Disputes Act. Now, this piece of legislation talks about how you go about terminating people. What is critical to understand, and this is where I think some people don't fully sort of haven't fully thought about things, but the Industrial Disputes Act has a term called workmen, and it essentially covers a class of people who are called workmen. Now, in today's sort of environment, most people think of workmen as people who sit on factories floors and essentially sort of provide services based on that. The language actually in the legislation is extremely wide. It includes all people who are sort of in technical sort of any sort of service, and that definition is wide enough to cover pretty much anybody other than people who are in a significant managerial position or who are in supervisory sort of positions. And there is sometimes people tend to look at it as slightly differently. They think that anyone who is considered a manager within in an organization is not part of this definition. It's actually fairly wide. So I would say in any organization, about 90% of your workforce actually falls within the category of someone who's called a workman. And therefore, the provisions of the Industrial Disputes Act, which talks about how you go about sort of terminating people, then applies to sort of companies. I can get into the details around how you go about that process, but I don't know if this is the appropriate time. I can wait if the question comes up.
No, I understand. This is very useful. The distinction between a layoff and the example and termination is very useful. I think especially when you spoke about the examples of how they were set up in an era where perhaps there were some kind of disruptions to the regular kind of ongoing of business. Although I must say electricity disruption is still a challenge today. That challenge hasn't gone away, but obviously of different type today. All right, that's interesting. This is very useful. Thank you, Ajay, for sharing some of that. So, I think when we started kind of talking about, Sankar started talking about the risks associated with whether you are terminating or letting go of people in the form of the layoff. There are risks associated with that. We spoke about obviously the brand risk associated with that, and especially in today's economy, brand is a big element of that. Other risks, Sankar, from your example, from your experience that you can think of, and obviously there are legal risks associated with that, but outside of the brand, any other considerations in the example that you thought of that the organization was looking at?
That's number one. The fact that during the whole process, if it's when you lay off employees or you make them redundant and you go through this redundancy program, weeks and months, and management's time is on getting this right, and to the extent that is one of the risks that management faces is that they take their eye off the business, and so to some extent the normal business. Number two, the redundancies in the also leaves behind a what should I say, trauma within the organization. That well, but that's not the end of the role, because if there are who work together and 50 are let go, there are still 50 that remain who carry colleagues who are let go. So they always are full, they to be dismissed, disengaged, they are demotivated, they are confused, and maybe some of them are angry as well. So, you still have to deal with the risks of losing good employees who you thought you would want to retain after letting go of the others. So you still have to communicate, engage with, and make sure that these employees are dealt with in a way that this trauma that affects them is minimized. That's another big risk that you face. And all the other things, it's not just a question of letting people go, because once you let people go, then the facilities become empty. So management's attention will be then to say, why do we need this large office? What can we do with real estate? And then what about this and what about that? So one thing leads to another. And this whole program becomes interminable in a sense. It goes on and on and on and drags on. And management's attention is so focused on this for weeks and months that the business suffers more than it should as a result of this exercise.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. Ajay, just chiming in from your experience, what about the legal and financial risks associated with the company who perhaps doesn't get it right?
Sure. I think the point that Sankar was making about preparation, and the reason preparation is so important, is because of the legal challenges of terminating people. And let me just talk through what that is. The Industrial Disputes Act that I talked about, which is the one that is likely to be relevant to most companies that are going down the termination route, talks about the concept of, there are a number of provisions, one of which is if you had to terminate somebody, you're supposed to terminate them from cause. In India, we don't have a concept of at-will employment, which means that the only way you can go about terminating somebody is if you had a reasonable sort of reason to do so. Now, those reasons could be sort of from a company's perspective, the fact that that job role doesn't exist, the fact that you don't need a certain set of people. Now, all of this needs to come with a certain type of justification. Now, let's assume for a moment that in a company where you've decided that you've got, say, 100 people, you now need to let go of 20 because that particular role or that particular sort of type of product that you're developing or software that you're working on or sort of the salesperson in that particular role doesn't need to be there anymore for whatever sort of business reason the company has got. Now, when you go about terminating somebody in India, the thing that you need to be mindful of is the fact that you need to, obviously the law requires you to give notice as well as compensation if you did terminate. But the key thing to sort of understand is that one of the requirements under law is a concept called LIFO, or that's essentially last in, first out, which means that if you're taking a bunch of people and you're using that as the basis to go ahead and try and sort of terminate, you need to first let go of the person who came in last and then sort of follow through with, so if in a group you had 40 people who perform similar roles and you want to get rid of 20, typically most companies will try and retain the top performers and let go of the people who are sort of not necessarily the best performers. Now that becomes a challenge because the law says that you can't take that distinction. You can't fundamentally make that distinction on the basis of performance. You need to be able to you need to go about this process of first terminating the 20 who came in last and then sort of retain the people who were there earlier. Now this throws a huge legal, obviously apart from the legal challenge, the internal challenge of cherry picking and how do I manage to sort of retain the right people. And that's where companies then sort of try and use alternate means to try and sort of find more sensible ways to remove the people that they do want to remove. And the most commonly used sort of process that I've seen is the concept of a VRS, or essentially a voluntary sort of scheme where you talk to the employee. And that's why you'll see that if you look at news articles, if you look at the way a number of companies have done this, typically it happens on the day of that you decide to terminate people, you essentially call people into a room. You say that we intend to terminate you. You either do the town hall and then meet people individually. But most of those conversations are about the fact that we intend to terminate you. Do you want to instead resign? And I mean, I get this question all the time. I've found that in India, the most common form of termination is actually resignation. And that resignation realistically is a resignation that has been prompted by somebody who's had a conversation with you and say that you necessarily sort of will be terminated. Therefore, you've got this opportunity. Now, the reason people take that, obviously in India, is there's the social stigma attached to being terminated and the chance of getting another job. If you were terminated, most people will question why you were terminated, and that makes it difficult for you to pick up another job. So most employees, given an opportunity and given the fact that they may realize that it's inevitable, will then sort of turn back and say, can I resign? The problem lies in that communication. And that's where I have seen a lot of these things go bad. The preparation in terms of how you communicate, what you're not coercing somebody into actually going down that resignation route. All of that becomes very, very critical from a termination perspective. And therefore, you will find that in India, when people have these large-scale terminations, or even if it's, say, 5 people, what you'll do is typically, if you're not able to follow this last in, first out sort of rule, what you will do is then sort of actually try and have a conversation and let go of people. And that obviously throws a bunch of different legal and HR sort of issues. We've had in the press over the last couple of years, I don't know but there was one large thing that happened in the last 2 years. A large IT company in India went out and had these conversations. Before you knew it, people were had recorded these conversations. It was all over the media. There was a lot of sort of firefighting at the back end to explain how they did it. They went to the Labor Department. So I think a large part of the way you prepare for these things is to get some of those processes right. And I think Sankar sort of talked about those 5 or 6 things that he had done in the other company. And I think that is probably the most critical thing even from a legal perspective. The law is quite clear about how you can do this. It's very complex, and therefore most companies will try and find a softer HR approach to try and sort of reduce people through that conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you spoke about essentially a coerced termination or a coerced resignation And I think it's certainly a path a lot of the organizations I know fully take. So I think some of the examples that you were talking about, perhaps I've certainly seen that happen in organizations which are larger in size. But let's talk about some of the practicalities of a small and medium enterprise, which may or may not have a resident a legal team, may perhaps be relying on external kind of partners, may or may not have generous resources to give away, and may not have the time to do the preparation. So what are some of the practical ways that a small and medium enterprise can go about this process, be on the right side of the law, and at the same time be generous, knowing that they still have to balance, the business still has to go on. They can dole out all the goodies to the departing people, but that may not leave them anything for the remaining people who continue to be in the business. So how do you strike the balance between being on the right side of the law, not having enough resources at your disposal, but yet being able to do it? So maybe Sankar, just from your experience, and then we'll get Ajay to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we've always, when we speak of example, we always think of the big guys, the large companies, and how they do it, and so on. Sources, the capabilities to do all of these things, which the small and medium enterprises may not have. But the good thing about small and medium enterprises is that, in many cases, the extent of the downsizing is unlikely to be in the thousands. They're going to be very few, and they can be managed quite effectively locally. You don't have to take a sledgehammer to swat a fly. It's enormously complicated. But whether you're small or medium, you do need to make sure you're on the right side of the law. So it's advisable that to advise them on the legal aspects. And I'm sure, given that they are small and medium enterprises, Ajay will give a discount to his usual fees. So that would be fine. But on the HR front, what I would suggest is many of them may not even have a HR team, and certainly not an experienced HR team to deal with all of these. So I would think the onus falls on the chief executive or promoter, who's pretty much in these cases, driving the show, to be advised and to do it, in an empathetic way, but following the four corners of the law within the legal briefs, but to do it empathetically. The other thing that small and medium enterprises are good at doing is that they don't necessarily burden themselves with a whole heap of permanent employees. Many of them are very nimble and very lean to start with, and they also have the ability to quickly change their business model and to move into a variable cost model of employment, contract, fixed contract, fixed term contracts, or flexible working arrangements and the like. These are some of the things that they can do, and they can be done by large companies as well. Instead of sending people away, can we say, look, can you work half a day? It's better than not working at all. We don't want to let go of you, but you know what? We can't afford to keep you with us on a full-time basis, at least till we tide over this, difficult period for us. So can we have some flexible working arrangements? Would we be okay with a cut in pay and you work for 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week? You can explore options like this, which is a win-win situation for both the enterprise as well as the employees affected.
Yeah, good point. Ajay, so besides a lower fee bill, as Sankar suggested, anything else that you can recommend? Just practical tips for people to follow?
Sure. I think the key to this is to start by just understanding, obviously, how easy it is to sort of stay within the realm of law, at least to have a limited understanding that the law requires that you follow certain processes. See if there is a possibility to follow that. If you can't, then at least make sure that the employee is compensated to the extent that the law requires that you ensure that they are compensated. I think that tends to be a very important aspect to be able to defend against any sort of if say somebody wanted to sue you, at least you've got the ability to say that I've provided this person all of the sort of compensation and all of the payments that the law required me to pay, and therefore the sort of justification then only becomes around you being able to sort of explain why you did certain things in terms of the termination process. Very often I find that companies choose not, or perhaps lack of awareness, or the fact that they just sort of looking at this as a contractual termination. You look at what's in the contract and you say this is the end of it. The law, and I'll just sort of make one specific sort of and talk about one specific provision, because that's the most important one in the Industrial Disputes Act. There is a provision called 25F. It essentially says that any person who's being terminated needs to receive at least 1 month of notice, or if you have a higher notice in your sort of contract, then that notice period, and has to be paid 15 days of wage for every completed year of service. And that's the sort of called the retrenchment compensation. Now, if you can do these two things, then more often than not, you're pretty much largely on the right side of the law. The fact is, if you haven't paid that compensation, it could actually sort of result in the entire termination being annulled. And sort of the employee will actually have the right to be able to get reinstatement. So it is, I think, very, very critical for companies to at least ensure that that process under 25F is followed while they go ahead and terminate. Again, even if it was a sort of a discussion around a resignation, our recommendation is normally to at least include that additional compensation. Put it as an ex gratia amount. You don't necessarily need to call it as the termination sort of payment. Call it an ex gratia amount, but ensure that the employee doesn't sort of stand to lose as a result of this termination what the law otherwise sort of provides the person. So that, I think, is the key takeaway, at least from a legal, from an exposure perspective, to ensure that you at least ensure that the employee receives all of the dues that they were legally entitled to under the law.
Okay, I think you make a good point. So regardless of whether you're calling it a termination or even a resignation via discussion, pay for the notice period, whatever is as part of the contract, minimum of 1 month or more as per the contract, and 15 days of wages for every year of completed service. You do this, you're in the right side of the law. Very good to know that. All right, just quickly, a couple of quick questions, and hopefully we'll try and wrap this. There are different leaders kind of who are involved in this. There is HR, there is the legal, there are the promoters / CEO and other stakeholders involved. Perhaps even customers who get involved because the people who are serving them are no longer available to serve them. Now, what are your advice people to play those roles? Kind of any perspectives there, Sankar, across the different spectrum of the stakeholders? Let's start with the promoter CEO. You touched upon it a little bit, and maybe any customer perspective that you can throw light on.
Yeah, I think usually when this is done on a large scale, what tends to happen, what is good practice or best practice or leading matter is to set up a committee, a steering committee, so governance committee and the program management office. Governance committee is the very highest levels overseeing the program, taking critical decisions and so on. The program management committee works on a day-to-day basis, make sure that this program works like clockwork and issues as they arise are resolved. For example, if somebody threatens to go legal, what do we do? If somebody says, I want a little bit more, I want my medical to be extended by a few more months, what decisions are to be taken and so on and so forth, and then oversee the communication, prepare the communication, arrange the logistics and so on and so forth. So it's very critical that there is a full-time program of skilled people, which will definitely have a legal representative and HR. Their role would be to interact with all the peers in the organization and to make sure that they all sing same hymn sheet. That's very important. Sometimes these communications go completely awry because each head of department goes and stands before his set of employees and says in his or her own way, which is inconsistent with the message has been crafted at the very top. So the program management office has a very key role to play, and then there's a committee at top above it to provide the necessary stewardship. But one thought that occurs to me, Prashant, is that I spoke about arrangements. One of the things is, why are we doing this? We are doing this because we want to get our people costs where we think they should be, because the environment model has changed and so on. If we have the luxury of time, then I think companies can do a few things. One, offer a pay rather than a redundancy. Tell employees, look, either we freeze paying any this year, we value all the contributions to this company and we believe we have a bright future with all of you. So I'm going to ask everybody to take a 10% pay cut. And at the very top, to take a 50% pay cut. Now, can we do with that for some time? The tendency usually is to let go of people the pyramid, partly because there and it tapers off as we go up the hierarchy. But that getting rid of 2 people at the top is probably equal in terms to getting rid of 20 people down at the bottom. It makes a lot of a redundancy program by sending the signal that we are starting, there are no sacred cows here, and then to plow your way down. These are some things that the organizations can do if they have the luxury of time, but if they don't apply the guillotine, then they probably have to do it in a very different, if they can see things coming, they can do it in a much more orderly way, signal to the employees and more generally to the market at large.
Got it. Yeah, I think it certainly make a very interesting point about 2 people at the top may perhaps more than make up for 20 people at the lower rungs of the organization. However, in some of these cases, the 2 people are perhaps the promoters and the founders who are unlikely to be going anywhere, and just therefore the realities of the world kind of comes in. So we just kind of need to deal with it. Just moving to Ajay, kind of like you spoke about, this is the real world. This is what the world we live in. This is inevitable, despite kind of what we choose to do. What's your advice to leaders facing this situation?
I think, at least from my perspective, I think the key is communication. I've seen so many of these sort of downsizing sort of go either really well or really badly based on the way it was communicated. If there's a well thought out sort of process around what you intend to communicate, have some amount of sort of thought around having, I guess, somebody who's empathetic enough to be able to have conversations in the right way with people. I found that a large part of where we've had people try to sort of fight the company or sue the company has been based on that conversation they've had with the company or the way the company has treated them on that last day, in terms of how they've sort of explained something to them. It's normally anguish, it's ego, it's obviously loss of a number of things. But I think if that communication is handled well, if you can explain to the person why this is happening, it's not necessarily their fault, it's the organizations going through this, the fact that you will try and sort of help them through this process, you'll give them a good recommendation, you'll try and sort of help them move on, and obviously also sort of discuss a package that is sort of makes them feel that they've got at least a couple of months in their pockets to be able to sort of continue. It goes a long way in being able to sort of I guess, ensure that you don't have legal, sort of a bad legal situation. And in all of the sort of many ones that I've seen, the ones that have been most successful have been the ones that there was some amount of preparation around the communication with a backup. What if this happens? What if this person says this? So have an actual sort of set of FAQs that is handed over to pretty much anyone who's having this conversation, and that person knows exactly how to react to a specific type of question. And that's not difficult to do. That can be done in a day. It's just a matter of having somebody sit down, think it through, put that together, make sure that the people who are having these conversations know what to say. And I think in this day and age where people are recording things, where people are coming in and sort of you want to say the right thing during those conversations. You don't want to sort of go out and say, if you don't do this, we will do this to you. Those sort of things are, I think, at least in my view, think of the past. If you continue that, there is a high chance that you're opening yourself up to some amount of legal risk. So I would say go in and have the right communication. Make sure that communication ideally is vetted by somebody in legal. And ensure that there is sort of some consistency, like you said, in that communication to whoever it's going out to.
All right, wonderful. This has been very useful. Thank you, Sankar. Thank you, Ajay. Just quickly summarizing what we discussed today. The recognition that this is the. Sorry, Sankar, you want to add something?
There's just one final thought, Prashant. If just half a minute for one.
Absolutely, go on.
Very important. It's very important that companies who do this also continue to keep in touch with some of the better employees that they've had, because you never know. You're optimistic about the future. You think this is short-term pain. The company will be back on its feet and will be back on, and you want these employees back. So it's always a good idea for HR or whoever heads in the company to be in touch with at least some of the better employees. They may have joined other organizations, to be in touch with them and make sure that they have you, so that you can get them back when circumstances, as soon as.
Very, very important point, and I think I'm glad you made that. And that essentially is the essence of it. There is the business climate in which we work in, uncertain, unpredictable, fast-moving, And there will be times and situations when one will have to take some steps, despite there are various approaches to doing it, starting with flexible pay, distributing, perhaps looking at a cut across bigger people, larger set of people, as opposed to cutting a few people. Starting at the top, if you have the opportunity to do so, as opposed to a number of people at the bottom. Various ways to do about it. Thinking about who you're deciding to pick, and also recognizing there'll be impact of the people who are left behind, not just the ones who are leaving. While people understand the rationale of why this is happening, one has to recognize there are emotions associated with it. And one needs to deal with those emotions at that moment, but also later on. And therefore, being in touch with those people essentially means that one remains to respect them for the time they spend. I think I want to just close by saying something that somebody said stayed with me. Just because somebody wasn't successful at an organization doesn't mean they're a failure. They may have failed once, but failing once is not the same as being a failure. And I think recognizing that is a great way, both for the organization and for the individual, to recognize that this is perhaps a part of a journey, and we'll have many more milestones in that journey. Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Sankar. This has been very useful. I personally learned a few things, and I hope the audience learned from this as well. You can send in your comments or questions that you may have, hashtag SME Talent, and we hope to see some of your comments on this too. Thank you so much.